Bob Casalino, Katie Jentleson from the High is here to talk about her upcoming Minnie Evans exhibition and 4 decades of practice that drew on dreams and subconscious. And it's a great pleasure to have her here, and I am shutting up so that she can talk.
Hey, thank you, Lisa, for inviting me, and Aaron and everybody else who's been instrumental in making these past 48 hours so enjoyable for all of us. As Lisa mentioned, this is a show that this research that I'm presenting today comes from an exhibition that we're opening at the High in November of this year. And it's something that I've been working on for several years. And part of why I turned my attention to Minnie Evans is actually because of the way that her work has been coming up in a lot of larger American art contexts, including Bob's really amazing Supernatural America show of a number of years ago. And her work has also been appearing in places like the Venice Biennale and exhibitions that are really reappraising canons of surrealism through feminist and Afro-diasporic lenses. So it also kind of relates to a lot of the focus on surrealism that we heard from the talks yesterday. So all to say, you're my first audience for some of this new research. And one of the things that I'm really trying to push forward in my essay and how we're grounding Evans in this new exhibition, which I should also mention is going to travel to the Whitney Museum of American Art next summer. And so I'm very pleased to have my colleague Barbara Haskell here because she's going to be presenting it when it comes to the Whitney. And it will really be super exciting because that will mark a kind of 50-year return. Evans was one of the first Black women artists to have a solo show at the Whitney in 1975. And so to see her work represented in 2026 will really be an occasion for celebration and really understanding her work in new contexts. So one of the things with this project is understanding that Evans was very much about contextualizing her artistic practice, as Lisa said, within dreams and being in touch with her subconscious. But one thing that I'm trying to do for our audiences is really make clear that she was also responding to the real historical, social, political circumstances of her life. And in fact, all of our dreams and our subconscious are always kind of mining and transmuting the experiences that we have on a daily basis. And so what we want to do with Evans in the future is really understand the way those different forces, the kind of metaphysical, the unconscious, but also the real tangible circumstances of her life were very much intertwined in ways that we can see in her drawings. So with that being said, I will begin. In March of 1971, Minnie Evans sat for a rare interview with Celestine Ware, a Black feminist author and activist. At that time, Ware was producing a radio series on Black women artists, and she'd become fascinated by the work of Evans, who was still 4 years shy of her breakthrough solo show at the Whitney Museum of American Art. But she was increasingly becoming well known outside of her hometown of Wilmington, North Carolina. What is the lost world of Minnie Evans? Ware asks near the end of the interview. Initially, Evans appears reluctant to answer. I don't know about that, she demurs. But Ware continues to press, and eventually Evans relents, explaining that she has been experiencing visions her entire life, including ones involving the great flood described in the book of Genesis. Nations have been destroyed, she says, and a lot of the pictures that God has given me, he brought back from different nations. According to the Bible, there are thousands of nations that's been destroyed, and nobody knew anything about them. By the time of this interview, Evans had been making drawings for almost 40 years, creating a very diverse body of work, which you can see up on this screen. And the show is going to be more than 100 pieces, and you're going to get to see the kind of full scope of the ways that she drew and all the ways that she went from abstraction to more perspectival space and everything in between. But for the kind of focus of this talk, I'll just be talking about the kind of body of work that she made that became known as mandalas or mandalic drawings, because people received them as being like Buddhist drawing in terms of being diagrams of the universe. So her pictures arc from densely marked ink compositions of the 1930s to increasingly colorful and robustly detailed mandalas, reaching an apex with her collaged masterworks of the late 1960s, and tapering into narrative religious tableau, scenes with perspectival space that she had explored throughout her career. Although she worked mostly on paper, the range of her abstract and representational styles and the longevity of her production are rare among self-taught artists, who often only create toward the end of their lives when burdens of paid work and caregiving have fallen away. Evans, too, worked until she was no longer physically able. But the year that she turned 56, she shifted from decades of employment as a domestic worker to collecting admissions at Airlie Gardens, a task that allowed her to sit at the edges of one of the most beautifully landscaped gardens of the southeastern United States and make art in her idle time. She hung her work on and near the garden's exquisite wrought iron gate, which, as several scholars have already noted, bears a striking resemblance to the curvilinear twining of her later mandalas. In this way, she was able to sell or give her drawings to Airlie's visitors, leading to a reputation beyond Wilmington, and eventually a 1966 exhibition right here in New York on the Upper East Side at a church called the Church of the Epiphany. And this exhibition took The Lost World as its name. My forthcoming exhibition of Evans's work, which opens at the High Museum of Art in Atlanta in November of this year, and then, as I mentioned, we'll travel to the Whitney Museum of American Art in the summer of 2026, intentionally revives the title of that show, not only as a callback to her New York debut, and to emphasize her conviction that her art was a portal into extinct realms, but also because this project is really in pursuit of another kind of lost world, specifically the constellation of personal circumstance and historical events that shaped Evans's life. She once said, "I have a very interesting life. I have more in my life than I can tell of." Continuing her allusion to the things that have evaded possible verbalizing, she also noted, "I can't tell you everything. I got to keep some things to myself." The epitaph that appears on her grave marker even reads, "Dedicated to the memory of Minnie Evans, whose paintings speak that for which there are no words." Inspired by these notions of the limitations of speech, as well as how the faces at the centers of her mesmerizing mandalas suspend us in the tension between their arresting gazes and sealed lips, this talk, which is adapted from my essay for the catalog, simultaneously privileges Evans's voice and probes the things she left unspoken. Evans was so definitive about the drawing that began her career that she titled it My Very First. While its dense ink markings may appear to bear little resemblance to the lushly colored compositions that would follow, protoforms of her later work are abundant in this piece. The nested arches of rainbows, the segmented coils of serpentine creatures, and multiples of circles with dark centers that presage the unflinching stares of her later mandalas. Evans recalled having visions since childhood, and this drawing came from a particularly powerful episode that she remembered like this. "I had wrote my grocery order, and after I tore that off, then I'd taken my pencil and went to making some funny thing. I don't know why, but I just kept on making a lot of funny things, and I made a page full, and Saturday I went back there and I got another page and went to painting more funny things. Well, I didn't bother those things anymore until my grandmother died in 35. And 2 to 3 weeks after that, I went to painting and writing a little more of those things." So, especially early on, Evans did not sign or date her work, often adding those details later and rarely titling pieces, as she did with My Very First. Although she dated this work to around Good Friday of 1935, her grandmother had died the previous year. So, the account that I just recited, as well as others that she gave, have engendered some confusion about when she actually completed this drawing and had that vision. Writing about Howard Finster, another artist who had visions from childhood, Norman Girardot notes how Finster's initiatory vision also varied from account to account, but nonetheless operated as a kind of mythic hinge in how he explained the beginning of his artistic odyssey in 1976. Evans's memory of her initiatory vision is likewise variable, but it is always anchored qualitatively by the passing of her grandmother, Mary Croom. Evans's own mother, Ella, was only 13 at the time of her birth and did not marry her biological father. So Evans and Ella lived with Mary until Evans was in her teens, a situation that created an extraordinary bond between granddaughter and grandmother. Mary was also especially empathetic towards Evans's dream life, which left her sleepless at night, fatigued at school, and ostracized for being different. Evans remembered, "My grandmother told me it wasn't dreams that I was having visions. I would tell my mother, but she couldn't understand or didn't try because I was a little child." A decade after Mary's passing, Evans would encounter another person who gave her confidence in her gift. This was the mid 1940s, an era of significant international turmoil, and in Evans's hometown of Wilmington, local turmoil as well. Wilmington had long been a city with significant economic standing due to industries like cotton milling and turpentine mining, but its population more than quadrupled between 1941 and 1944 as new Army and Air Force bases sprouted up to help support the war effort. These developments also made the Carolina coast a target, and in 1942, the Coast Guard famously sunk a German U-boat in nearby Cape Hatteras. Rumors of enemy attacks circulated widely, adding anxiety for Wilmingtonians like Evans, who was also by then the mother to 3 adult sons, 2 of whom were enlisted. Attuned to the market opportunity of uncertainty, fortune tellers and psychics had increased in number during the Great Depression, and war increased their numbers again in the 1940s. One day in 1944, while running errands with her granddaughter, Evans encountered a fortune teller named Madame Tula, who had set up shop outside the Greens Five and Dime in downtown Wilmington. Tula agreed to give Evans a reading. "You are wrapped completely in color," she told her, adding that Evans had something of all the nations. By this point, Evans had a habit of carrying around the drawings she'd been making, tucked into a magazine, which she'd somehow forgotten that day. So she returned to Tula, sharing drawings like mosquito bombs, one of several in which Tula saw the pictorial equivalents to the violent apparatus of war, and Tula insisted that Evans continue channeling her visions. Evans responded by painting Invasion Picture in oil, a medium she used sporadically throughout her career. In Invasion Picture, multiple perspectives, scales, and hermetic forms collide to terrifying effect. A plane that pictorially echoes the insectoid name given to World War II combat aircraft like the de Havilland Mosquito soars from the top right quadrant of the composition, about to pass over a landmass carved by various waterways that mirror Wilmington's complex coastal topography. So nobody got the light to work ever, right? This is the plane. And these waterways, this is what Wilmington looks like. There's a lot of different creeks and bays that went out to the ocean. And then this is the mountain of white skulls. And I'm going to talk about it in a second. The mound of white skulls that cluster beneath the main aircraft have an undeniable kinship with paintings by Marion Sporebush, who also produced work foretelling the mass deaths of World War II. Like Evans, Sporebush began heeding visions after the loss of her family matriarch and became so well known that in the summer of 1943, a profile about her was nationally syndicated and published in newspapers all over the country. Although Evans was a reader, she would likely have mentioned Sporebush if she had been aware of her, as she talked about other key sources of affirmation during this period, including Tula's reading and Drums of Fu Manchu, a movie she saw repeatedly. This film, which began showing in Wilmington in 1940, was effectively a reboot of a decades-old villain whose popularity had previously thrived on anti-Asian xenophobia of the late 19th century. Now, at a time when Japanese Americans were being interned in camps across the American West, Fu Manchu was being introduced to audiences anew. Evans was fascinated by a plot point involving a scroll with ancient calligraphic writing, which seemed to mirror the automatic writing and mark-making of her early art. She saw the film multiple times, once even bringing her book of drawings with her and sharing them with other filmgoers, commenting, "Whoever made that movie is cooperating with my pictures." The Allied troops also seemed to cooperate. storming the beaches of Normandy within days of Evans's completion of Invasion Picture, fulfilling Tula's prophecy that that quote, "The invasion in Europe is not going to happen until you paint that picture." Wartime affected not only the content of Evans's work in this period, but also the materiality. She favored Crayola crayons, which had become widely commercially available in the 1930s, but became limited in their color palette, but the limited color palette of her work in the early 1940s reflect how wartime pigment shortages reduced the number of colors featured in each box. Paper was also scarce, leading to national campaigns for Americans to recycle and donate paper in drives, and Evans was among them. When she decided to reuse a discarded sheath of US Coast Guard stationery in 1944, the size of her drawings increased slightly to 9 by 7 inches. After the war, and with greater access to materials, she settled into her most common scale of 12 by 9-inch paper, and eventually came to rely upon Crayola's 64 color box with a built-in sharpener, which was released in 1958. Her family members remember her house being filled with boxes of partially used Crayola crayons because she could not replace single crayons that ran out without buying a whole new set. The first 15 years of Evans's drawing practice were thus marked by major changes in the world around her, local and global. In addition to losing her primary caregiver, Evans's own identity as a wife and mother went through massive changes during this period. Her 3 boys were grown, and her house was not yet filled with all of the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who would later depend on her. That she was having deepening experiences with visions at midlife, a time when women experience drastic psychological and physiological changes associated with menopause, has also never been mentioned. Then in 1948 came another transformative shift in her daily life. The estate where she had lived and worked since she married her husband Julius 40 years earlier changed hands, and she was given a new job of collecting admissions at the gate of Airlie Gardens, which were the gardens of the estate that were now open to the public and are still open to the public. 7 days a week, rain or shine, for close to 20 years, she sat at the entry, first unsheltered and later in a small gatehouse. Outside of the popular Azalea Festival that showcased the garden's 700,000 azalea specimens in bloom each April, visitors would trickle in, allowing Evans time to read, pray, and make drawings. She would eventually become part of the garden's attractions herself, featured in the brochure for the 1971 season, and decades after her death, honored with a small bottle chapel and metal sculptures inspired by the biblical beasts and angels that she drew. The gardens became part of her as well, supercharging her newly emergent mandelic forms with its kaleidoscopic botanical varietals and their pollinators. The sweet-petaled blooms of begonias and primrose, the impossible symmetry of butterfly wings, jasmine vines and Spanish moss joining with garden statuary, and urns bursting with potted arrangements, all began appearing in her work. But Evans was not cataloging specimens in the studious and isolated way of a naturalist. Instead, she translated the ordered chaos of the gardens with her matching aesthetic of fullness. The most photographed feature of the garden is the Airlie oak, a 400-year-old tree with a circumference of more than 25 feet, to which Evans completed her own love letter in 1954, possibly with reference to a 1950 postcard that showcased its April aura of white and pink azaleas. For this piece, Evans invented a one-time process that involved working with the skins lingering on the insides of old paint cans, likely left over from the recent completion of her green and brown gatehouse. She massaged the dried paint skins with turpentine to loosen them, and then layered them into the forms of her composition. Her centering of the tree's iconic girth, which takes up so much of the frame that the canopy is nearly cut out of the picture, pays tribute to a specimen that has withstood the passage of time and all that comes with it, and indeed, it still stands today. The year that she made this work, the heroic oak endured Hurricane Hazel, the only Category 4 storm that has ever hit this stretch of the North Carolina coast, and a disaster that caused massive destruction along Airlie Road. In addition to experiencing this flood of biblical proportions that must have reinforced her sense that her visions were related to an antediluvian past, Evans had just lost her husband, Julius, the previous year. Her depiction of the great oak, with its tactile brown bark, and limbs wrapping around the trunk in a tight embrace, might also be read as a tribute to her beloved husband, who, even though he had always been quite skeptical of her visions, had been a major source of support and protection to her throughout the life they spent together at Airlie, a place which, as I'll explore in the next section, really had its own kind of weather. Before it changed ownership and became a public garden in 1948, Airlie Gardens was part of a 150-acre estate maintained by the combined fortunes of Pembroke Jones and Sarah Green Jones, who married in 1884. Julius was already working for Pembroke when Evans married him in 1908, and from that point, the Evanses lived and raised their growing family in a 5-room tenant house that was only about 300 yards away from the lodge, one of several extravagant homes that the Joneses kept on the property. Once her youngest son, George, turned 3, Evans worked in the household full-time, with her sons also taking on service roles there as children. The various residences that she would look after were filled with works of fine art, which might have become even more world-class once Sarah was remarried after Pembroke's death in 1919 to Henry Walters, a key player in the Gilded Age practice of building major art collections that would eventually become the cornerstones of major American museums, in Walters' case, the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. Although this section explores the various effects of Evans's time with the Joneses and later Walterses, it's important to pause and note that she had access to other spaces of beauty and inspiration throughout her life, among them her church, the home of her grandmother, and the many natural spaces she explored beyond the bounds of Airlie Gardens, because Wilmington is an extraordinary, beautiful place. Depictions of Jesus that she made in the 1960s, for instance, probably have more in common with mass-produced images, including this illustrated Seventh-day Adventist text that she was known to have favored, than Old Master religious scenes she might have seen at the Joneses. Works like these, with all of her patterns, could reflect, as others have suggested, the extravagant rugs and coverlets and wallpapers that Evans swept, laid, and dusted at the Joneses, but they also read like patterned swaths of fabric that she likely saw her grandmother Mary, who was an esteemed seamstress, plow through by the ream, as well as the quilts she might have made from their remainders. The scalloped semicircles that lace the edges of so many of her mandalas and their frequent pendants featuring coastal horizons, meanwhile, may correspond to her memories of rising early to gather shellfish with her mother Ella in Wrightsville Beach in the years they worked as sounders before their marriages. Evans' access to other aesthetic realms notwithstanding, the exceptionalism of the grandeur she was to witness at Airlie cannot be overstated. In an early 1930 account of the gardens, writer Cora Harris declares their beauty incomparable and muses about the poetry that Homer might have written had he been to Airlie, where Rudolf Toepel, Kaiser Wilhelm I's former gardener, had been hired to create Earth's paradise in all its glory. In 1912, Sarah's daughter Sadie married the soon-to-be very celebrated architect John Russell Pope, who designed various buildings at Airlie, including the Temple of Love, a miniature version of the domed and colonnaded structures he would later create for the National Gallery of Art and the Jefferson Memorial. The Joneses were known for their generosity, hosting the likes of the Astors, the Vanderbilts, and the Roosevelts at their various homes in Newport, Rhode Island, New York City, and at Airlie, where the old growth trees provided a unique opportunity for extravagant Southern Gothic-style dinners, often held outdoors underneath their generous canopies. As beautiful as these parties may have been to take part in or to witness, someone had to set the tables, course the dinners, and refill the glasses of the revelers whose host was remembered for showing no restraint at his parties. Accounts of the Joneses emphasize that their benevolence extended to their staff, who were regularly feted, especially on Christmas. The boys in service were encouraged to participate in a local choir, albeit one that sang hagiographic songs about Pembroke, while he and Walters tossed $5 and $10 bills at the performers. This setup is telling. It hints at how the Joneses' alleged generosity was entwined with the maintenance and attendant degradation of white-dominated patriarchal relations. Deeper looking reveals details that cannot be found in the various glowing accounts of the Joneses written by and for white Wilmingtonians. One of Evans's sons, for example, remembered that during the Joneses' extravagant parties, young boys on staff were forced to compete for money by climbing to the top of a grease pole. So yes, Evans was surrounded by the beauty of Airlie, but as someone whose labor was intrinsic to its inner workings, she could not unsee all that it took to maintain that glossy exterior. I believe that she processed the tangle of beauty and cruelty that shaped her life widely across her work, and that it's especially visible in the unstable pathos of her mandalas, which Sharon Patton once described as bearing psychological ambivalence. Evans sometimes composed her mandalas as bust portraits, allowing their central faces to rest in ornamental layers that radiate into headdresses above and extravagant collars beneath. In others, however, the heads appear eerily disembodied, emerging from foliated auras in a kind of hide and seek that feels equal parts alluring and terrorizing. But perhaps the most jarring features of her mandalas is the intensity and often multiplicity of eyes. A central pair inevitably locks the viewer into a staring contest. Many mandalas contain additional eyes, sometimes in pairs, while others have single isolated eyeballs that result in cyclopean grotesquerie. Her youngest son, George, remembered that a man once returned an artwork because the eyes kept him awake at night. Truth. And they seem to have bothered Evans herself, who once related that she starts with the resolution to have no extra eyes, but then they work themselves in. Their intensity and abundance perpetuate the fear and claustrophobia of being watched, whether by God, the ultimate arbiter of fates whose all-seeing might Evans worshiped dearly, the glowing glare of nocturnal animals and the surreal faces that can emerge from the gnarled bark of Airlie's old growth trees, which might have spooked her during her walks home back to her cabin at night, or the watchful eyes of employers requiring the utmost discretion. That most of her mandalas, just get back to this, that most of her mandalas have mouths drawn in silence, sometimes in a slight smirk, seemingly illustrates a remark recorded in one of the histories of Airlie. The help knows a lot about the household. They evermore do. The Joneses were not in Wilmington year-round, but that did not mean that the Evans family or other Black employees working for them would have felt at liberty to enjoy their grounds during their hiatuses, as some accounts have suggested. To the contrary, Black Wilmingtonians of Evans's generation grew up keenly aware of the tenuousness of race relations in their city and could never forget the 24 hours of terror that unfolded on November 10th, 1898, when a white supremacist lynch mob murdered between 20 and 200 Black citizens. The Wilmington Massacre, as it is now known, erupted after years of growing white resentment that Black Americans had so quickly and successfully built up political capital, wealth, and institutions, as exemplified by Alexander Manly, the publisher of Wilmington's Black newspaper, The Daily Record. In August 1898, a white newspaper in Wilmington, the Morning Star, published a speech by white suffragette Rebecca Lattimore Felton, who horrifically insisted that white women were in peril of unwanted sexual advances by Black men, a narrative that would indeed motivate lynchings for decades to come, from Ed Johnson to Emmett Till. Manly, whose biological father was the white former governor of North Carolina, knew well the plight of Black women who had been raped for generations by white men. And while he did not air the personal story of his mother, he ended his editorial by boldly pointing out the obvious hypocrisy. He wrote, "You cry loud for the virtue of your women, while you seek to destroy the morality of ours." That he took this courageous stand several months in advance of state and county elections tragically gave various contingents of white supremacists in the region an opening to create a campaign that would undo Wilmington's Reconstruction era progress in Black office holding, businesses, and property ownership. On the morning of November 10th, a mob of 500 met at the city's armory and advanced on Manly's printing press, which they burned in a fire that Evans, just shy of her 6th birthday, would have been able to smell. So near was she living to the mob's violence. As their ranks grew to 2,000, the mobs marched through the streets of downtown Wilmington, blocks away from her home, armed with rifles and wheeling a wagon equipped with machine guns. At least publicly, Evans didn't reveal much about 1898, saying of the white people who perpetrated it, they get that way sometimes. But her life was upended by the massacre. One of her cousins was among those shot and had to lie out in the street overnight. He survived and relocated, as did her great grandmother, Rachel, who left for New York, and Evans never saw her again. On the night of the riot, many Black Wilmingtonians who were too frightened to stay in their homes found temporary shelter in nearby forests, as well as the tree-canopied cemeteries around the city. Evans spoke repeatedly about nightmares she had of ending up in a cemetery. I started having those terrible dreams, old men dressed up like the old prophets. They would carry me down to Soldier Cemetery. I woke up more times in that cemetery, she said. She made a work based on this vision titled A Dream, Prophets in the Air, alluding with its toppled statuary to a terrible destruction. As a face crowned by devilish horns emerges from an urn-like structure to the right, the white-colored prophets hover overhead, one with his arms outstretched as though it has just dropped Evans into a hiding spot behind a tree. Over the past 40 years, scholars have come to understand the persistent occurrence of visionary experiences among Black Americans and other marginalized groups as an individual's defensive response to the stresses of the real external world. Bridget Cooks opens the essay that she wrote for Bob's show for Supernatural America. She opens her essay dedicated to Black visionary practices of artists like Jack Whitten and Betty Saar with another radical visionary, Nat Turner. The nearly 30 years of dehumanizing enslavement that Turner suffered were the true reason for his 1831 rebellion, but he explained his impetus as coming from two visions, one of his ancestors being captured in Africa, and another foregrounding the insurrection itself. When Evans accounts for her visions, and when the accounts that she gave during her lifetime are studied more closely, they can likewise be understood as propelling her into action, not only to draw or die, as she famously recounted, but in actually shaping the contours of her formal arrangements. Evans recalled, for example, a scene in which she closed her eyes and opened them again to see that a beautiful light appeared in my room, and the light up in the northeast corner, and there was a great wreath. In another description of possibly the same experience, she remembered waking up one morning, going numb and passing out, regaining consciousness, and then walking to her front porch where everything I looked at was rainbow. What she saw astounded her. I dreamt the whole sky, the whole element was nothing but pictures put together like this, just as far as I could see. They were all in the yard, they were all in the bushes, they were all on the trees. Her visions thus became a source for the colorful, radiant, and foliated nature of her mandalas. In addition to works inspired by specific visions, like the cemetery piece that we just saw, her more generalized descriptions of these extrasensory moments account for the hallmarks of so many of her mandalas, from their frequent featuring of a light source, typically as a setting or rising sun, to how centrally positioned faces emerge from wreath-like silhouettes with leafy canopies. The intertwining of her verbal description of visions and the formal aesthetics of her mandalas reinforces remarks Evans made about where her art did and did not come from. In an early letter to Nina Howell Starr, the photographer who would bring Evans's work to wide renown from the 1960s onward, Evans was adamant that life among the Joneses did not impact her art. My drawings did not come from any of the pictures out of Mrs. Jones's homes. They came from my head and they're still coming, she told Starr. I think it would be, and then she added to Starr, I think it would be better to put aside that part of the story. I think it would be better to have a short story that the public would take than to have a long story the public would not accept. I hope you will agree with me. Evans understood, as many self-taught artists do, that she had to account for her brilliance in a way that was believable and safe, and that even if it was true that she had been affected by the beauty of the Jones estate, as well as its ugliness, it was probably best for a wide range of reasons not to say it. Evans was polite about the Joneses, saying very little that could be taken the wrong way, save for comments like, you just couldn't get through to them. Her insistence that her art had no relationship to what she saw there could have been a matter of pride, not wanting to owe that part of herself to them in any way, as well as a defense mechanism against possible retribution. But her note to Starr that they should give a shorter, more believable story about her art also seems to demonstrate her grasp of what a powerful rhetorical device visions can be for explaining her artistic impulses to the various skeptics in her life. Whether her visions fully dictated what appeared in her drawings, or her accounts of them emerged as a narrative armature for what she was already making, or most likely some combination of these two forces were at work, visions became the believable part of the story. Thank you.
Can you say a little bit more about what connection you know she had to the trained art world? Um,
Sure.
and
Yeah,
what influence, if any, did that have on her perspective?
sure. And that's the rest of my essay that I like cut out for time concerns. But so basically, Nina Hallstar, who took this photograph, is herself a kind of late in life blooming artist, a photographer who gets her MFA at the University of Florida, Gainesville when she's 58, after she's kind of raised her family. And through a series of interesting circumstances that I won't get into, she kind of starts being interested in photographing Minnie Evans. And then Nina becomes her kind of, um, catalyst for getting seen in New York, because Nina and her husband, when he retires from the University of Florida, they move to New York. And so from 1966, which is that first exhibition in a church, and it goes on to another church, that's Nina's church, she starts having these shows in New York, and she's also having some shows in Wilmington. And she gets picked up by artists or galleries that are interested in surrealists, like the Art Image Gallery, Dorothea Silverman's gallery. There's also the Emergent gallery kind of structure forming around self-taught art in this era. She gets showed by Phyllis Kind. Jean Dubuffet collects her work, so on and so forth. And Minnie comes to New York. She comes to some of her shows, and one of her children is living also in the Bronx at this time, so she comes for family reasons too. And she does have one really impactful experience at the Metropolitan Museum that she references, where she sees art of scale, and that's what leads to I got to go way back in my slides, but these kind of collages that she starts making in the late 60s, which I didn't talk about, but sorry, am I crashing it? Can I start at the beginning of the? Oh, sorry. Oh, I thought I crashed it, but it was just my black slide. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So this in the late 60s, after she's had several presentations in New York. And what those are, it's only about 20 of them in existence. She cuts out old pre-existing Mandelic drawings and collages them onto board and then in paints them. And so that, to your question, I mean, she kind of has this, but she's already seen old master painting, and she's already seen world-class works of art, in these domestic interiors. So it's not like it's her first encounter with trained artists from throughout history, but she acknowledges that it affected her in this certain way in this moment. And she doesn't really have significant exchange with like other practicing artists who are alive beyond Nina, but her and Nina have a really interesting kind of aesthetic um, connection and kinship, because Nina is trained by a photographer who does surrealist like double and triple exposures, and so she kind of makes things that actually look a lot like Minnie's drawings, but just in photographic media. Um, but yes, there isn't a big kind of what's the word, feedback loop where she's getting, after her own shows are being seen, she's not receiving kind of new inputs from other artists or art history in a particularly significant way, because she's still based in Wilmington. Yes.
Thank you. That was such an interesting talk. I was really intrigued by her use of crayon
Yeah.
and how that might have affected her reception, to follow up on what you were saying. I was thinking about Janet Sobel, who turned to crayon because
Yeah.
of a paint allergy.
Oh.
And so thinking about the works as being rather small and a lot of crayon, like, would that have affected, people wanting to collect these, or how they thought of them as I feel like the medium has a lot of baggage
Yeah, I think it still
with it.
does. I think it still does. I mean, I don't think that she didn't have a lot of she like the show that she had at the Whitney in 1975 happened for a lot of interesting reasons that in fact like part of again the book is going to go into that in detail. Um but it's kind of misleading as to how successful she was commercially in her lifetime. Like she didn't have a big collector base. Nina worked with all of these different galleries in Chicago, New York, and even London. And pretty much every Evans show they did was a commercial failure. But so there wasn't a kind of, I don't think it was the crayons that necessarily were the issue. Um, but yeah, just to say that it didn't come up. Like it wasn't like people were like, well, these are just drawings made with crayons. I think it was more just these looked so different than what these galleries were showing in their other exhibitions. And then also she did a lot of really religious work, which Erica's not here anymore, but has written extensively about the ways that the art world becomes secularized in the 20th century, and portraits of Jesus and scenes from Revelations are not going to like have a huge market value in the kind of last quarter of the 20th century. But yeah, crayons are a really interesting element of her. And a lot of self-taught artists use crayons, magic marker, all kinds of materials that were widely commercially available, and they did amazing things with them.
Thank you. So you already said that she didn't really have much like interplay with other artists at the same time. I'd imagine there wasn't a lot of like if you look at the mandalas, the structures of them are very similar to either like Aztec or even Hindu or Buddhist, mandalas that might be a little more technically oriented, but the forms are very similar. Did she have any kind of exposure or overlap with that?
I think in the Joneses' homes, that's the thing, because they collected, especially with their decorative arts collections, more so than their paintings. They weren't collecting, um, Buddhist or Tibetan wall hangings, but they were collecting ceramics and rugs and things that uh, bore these kinds of aesthetics. So that's absolutely true. And I think the way that her work has been put in the context of the Jones estate in the past has again been this kind of like, wasn't it great that she got to experience all of these amazing things in this beautiful place? And then part of what, and I agree, like, I mean, that is incredible to think about, that her brain was just seeing all these things, whether it was the natural beauty or these incredible collections within these estates. Like her brain was just absorbing this for all the decades that she worked there. But then part of why, I place emphasis on issues of racial violence and racism within how that estate was run is because you also have to remember that it wasn't like she was there to enjoy these things. And then in her mandalas, which I'm not the first person to say that they have this kind of like, push and pull of being both so mesmerizingly beautiful, but also some kind of secret that they're holding that might be deeply troubling. And yeah, and so that's the kind of way that I'm trying to make sure people understand that it's not just how great that she got to see things in this place. There was a lot of layers of how she had to mediate that. Yeah, I think that was the last question. Bob is trying. You can ask me later.